Hi, it's a pleasure to have you here. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to our channel and like this video. I craved comfort in the middle of chatter and clinking glasses, so I reached for a second helping of lasagna at my own table. The smell reminded me of Sunday afternoons from another lifetime, when food meant warmth, not judgment. I served myself without thinking, seeking refuge in melted cheese and tomato sauce layered with memories. Around me, the room bustled with conversation, but I felt like a ghost at my own celebration. No one offered help, no one praised the meal. They took, they talked, and they watched. For a moment, I pretended I was invisible, protected by the act of eating. I didn't know that this bite would become a weapon in the hands of those closest to me. I smiled politely as I scooped another portion, unaware that my gesture would become the trigger for a storm of cruelty. I had labored over that lasagna all day, sweating in the kitchen while others laughed in comfort. It wasn't greed, it was the only thing that had shown me kindness in hours. I needed nourishment, not just of the body, but of the heart. Yet as I raised my fork, I felt the air shift. Conversations dimmed. Forks paused midair. I sensed something building, like thunder gathering behind false smiles. And then it came, not from a stranger, but from the one I loved most. My daughter, Olivia, looked up with a glint in her eye I couldn't name yet. But it was the beginning of the end. "You eat like a pig," Olivia sneered, and the words hit me harder than any slap ever could. The room exploded into laughter, shrill, wicked, and too loud to escape. I froze, my fork still suspended, caught between defiance and disbelief. My heartbeat pounded louder than the noise around me. My mouth dried instantly, and I felt every eye drill into my skin. Olivia leaned back in her chair like a queen surveying her jester, pleased with the chaos she'd unleashed. A cousin knocked over his wine glass in hysterics. I looked around for rescue, for decency, but all I saw were mocking grins and phones raised to capture the moment. This wasn't a family dinner, it was an ambush. I wanted to vanish, to melt into the tablecloth, to wake up and realize it was a nightmare. But no dream could conjure this much cruelty so vividly. Olivia knew exactly where to strike, my body, my dignity, my most vulnerable insecurity. I had spent years giving her everything, protecting her, feeding her. And now she reduced me to a punchline in front of guests who should have defended me. I felt the heat rise in my face, a mix of rage, sorrow, and the deepest shame. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came. Only silence, the same silence I'd swallowed for years. And then the second blow came, not from words, but from ridicule dressed as play. My uncle snorted loudly and added, "Oink oink." His voice twisted in glee, not humor. Someone else imitated a pig's squeal, and in a flash, tiny bread crumbs began flying toward my plate like sad confetti. A handful of them stuck to the sauce, mocking the meal I had made with love. Laughter erupted again, louder now, and it felt like the walls themselves were closing in. I sat still, paralyzed by shame, as if any movement would make the humiliation worse. Each crumb felt like a pebble thrown at my soul, each giggle a dagger in my spine. I had never felt smaller, never so alone in a room full of people. My plate, once a source of comfort, had become a stage for cruelty. I looked to my husband, surely, he would speak up, put an end to this, but instead, I saw him smirking, the corner of his mouth curled in amusement. That betrayal shattered me more than the laughter. A man who had once whispered love to me in candlelight now watched as I was torn apart for sport. I couldn't breathe. My hands trembled in my lap, still trying to maintain some illusion of composure. A phone flashed, someone was recording. My degradation was now digital. My cheeks burned hotter than the lasagna, than the oven, than hell itself. And that's when I realized, I was done. They didn't just mock my hunger, they fed on my pain. Even my husband, the man I once trusted with my dreams, allowed a smirk to cross his lips as he watched my shame unfold. His silence roared louder than any insult, sealing his betrayal while the phones captured every second for their cruel entertainment. Guests chuckled and whispered, gleeful spectators at a spectacle they didn't deserve to witness. My hands, resting on the tablecloth I had ironed hours before, curled into fists beneath the surface. I bit my tongue so hard I tasted blood, more palatable than the bile of humiliation swelling inside me. One guest nudged another and said, "Record this, she'll never top this performance." The laughter now felt rehearsed, like a play they'd been waiting to perform. I had become a joke, and not even the man who once promised to protect me lifted a finger. A stranger might have felt pity, but these were my people, my family, and they feasted not on food, but on my humiliation. I couldn't stay there, frozen like a statue carved from disgrace, my dignity eroding by the second. My eyes searched for one person to speak, to defend me, but all I saw were phones held high and faces twisted in mockery. No one cared how I felt, no one noticed the tears that trembled at the edge of my eyes. I swallowed them down like bitter wine, praying I wouldn't break in front of them. But something broke anyway, not loudly, but deep within, a quiet shattering I knew I couldn't ignore. That moment, colder than the untouched wine in my glass, etched itself into my soul like frost. It wasn't just humiliation, it was a funeral for who I used to be. I stood slowly, every muscle resisting as if clinging to the illusion that I still belonged there. The chair creaked behind me, a quiet sound that somehow felt louder than all the laughter, like the final word in a cruel argument. I wiped away a tear with the back of my hand, not to appear strong, but because no one else would. The dining room faded into a blur of faces that once meant something, now just ghosts in expensive clothing. My footsteps echoed as I crossed the floor, and not one person tried to stop me. I passed Olivia without looking at her, she didn't deserve to see my eyes. The door was close, but the distance felt eternal. Still, with every step, I felt a weight falling from my shoulders. As I reached the exit, I didn't turn back. Let them remember the sound of that chair scraping across the tile and the silence that followed, the absence of my presence louder than any scream. I stepped into the night air, bitter and sharp, and breathed deeply for the first time in years. I left behind more than just a table, I abandoned the version of me who begged for scraps of affection. That house, that life, that family, none of it held value if it came wrapped in ridicule. I walked into the darkness with nothing but my purse and a heart heavy with betrayal. But in that moment, I wasn't weak. I was free. I didn't know where I was going, only that I would never return as the woman they laughed at. The flickering neon sign of a roadside motel welcomed me like a broken angel, buzzing in time with my racing thoughts. I walked into the lobby, face streaked with dried tears, and paid cash for a room without asking the price. The walls were thin, the sheets scratchy, and the air smelled faintly of old cigarettes, but it was mine. No eyes watching, no voices mocking, no daughter pointing fingers. I collapsed onto the stiff mattress, letting out a sob that cracked something loose in my chest. The silence felt violent at first, then comforting. Alone for the first time in years, I felt the shame begin to turn into something else, something sharper. I didn't yet know the name for it, but it burned hotter than anger. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay staring at the ceiling, counting every insult, every laugh, every face that looked away. I replayed the moment Olivia spoke, the way my husband smiled, the silence from those who should have defended me. And as the hours crawled by, a strange resolve began to form in the ashes of my humiliation. I wasn't going to beg for apologies. I wasn't going to explain myself. I was going to build something so strong, so undeniable, they'd all choke on their regret. The motel room became my cocoon, ugly, cramped, and temporary, but full of promise. Somewhere inside me, something fierce began to awaken. My story wasn't over. No, it was only just beginning. I spent the night curled beneath a thin blanket that smelled of bleach and old mistakes, my eyes swollen from crying, my throat raw from silence. The shame of the evening looped endlessly in my mind, Olivia's words, the laughter, the indifference of the man who once called me beautiful. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, twisted in amusement, unmoved by my pain. I clenched the edge of the pillow and whispered promises into the stale air, not to them, but to myself. Never again, I swore, through clenched teeth and aching heart. I would never again sit at a table where I was unwelcome, never again beg for love in a room full of mockery. The tears didn't stop, but slowly, they changed, from sadness to something sharper, more determined. By dawn, I was hollowed out, scraped clean by grief, but in that emptiness I found the space to make a vow. No one was coming to save me, and maybe that was my salvation. I didn't know how yet, but I would rise. Not for revenge, not entirely, but because I refused to let that night be the last chapter of my life. My story would not end in ridicule. I sat up slowly, legs sore, back aching, but spine finally straight. There was strength in that motel room, born from humiliation and hardened overnight. I wasn't just a woman who had been laughed at, I was a woman reborn in the fire of her own ruin. And if they thought that was my final scene, they hadn't seen anything yet. At sunrise, with swollen eyes and no plan but a burning need to move forward, I walked into the back alley of a greasy diner that smelled of bacon and despair. The manager didn't ask questions when I begged for work, he handed me an apron and pointed to the sink. I didn't argue, didn't flinch. I rolled up my sleeves and plunged my hands into scalding water, where leftover meals clung to pans like memories I had to scrub away. Each dish I washed felt like a step away from the woman they mocked. My fingers cracked from the heat, nails chipped, skin pruned and raw. No praise came, only silence and steam, but for the first time in days, I didn't feel invisible. I was earning my breath, dish by dish. By mid-morning, my arms ached, my back screamed, and grease clung to my skin like a second layer of shame, but I kept going. There was a rhythm in the clang of plates, a strange peace in the sweat and repetition. I didn't need validation, I needed direction. And strangely, I found it in the kitchen's chaos, in the heat, in the grime. I learned the language of cooks who didn't ask where I'd come from, only if I could keep up. I did. I worked until my reflection in the chrome became unfamiliar, not broken, just changed. I was no longer a woman holding back tears and silk. I was a survivor, gripping steel and grit with blistered hands and a soul on fire. Days turned into weeks, and each burn, each cut, each slipped knife or boiling splash carved new skin over old wounds. The pain didn't break me, it baptized me. My hands, once soft and scented with lotions, grew calloused and strong, able to lift pots heavier than the judgment I once carried. I learned to move with the fire, not against it, to dance with the dangers of the stove and emerge fiercer than before. The other cooks noticed. They didn't say much, but they nodded with something like respect. I had come in a stranger and become one of them, forged in grease and grit, built from nothing but willpower and necessity. I didn't flinch anymore. I had become flame-proof. In the haze of steam and shouting, I started remembering how to breathe with purpose. I wasn't just surviving, I was transforming. Every sizzle was a heartbeat, every plate a quiet rebellion against the version of me they buried in laughter. No one knew the story behind my eyes, and I didn't offer it. I let my work speak. I arrived early, stayed late, and claimed space in a world that had no room for tears. And still, in the solitude of the walk-in freezer or the break room, I whispered to myself, "You're not done." Because deep down I knew, something was coming. The pain had sharpened me, and one day soon, they'd see the woman they left behind, not broken, but reborn in fire. After long, back-breaking shifts at the diner, I began walking across town to a small culinary school tucked between a pawn shop and a laundromat. I sat in the back of the classroom, still wearing my kitchen shoes and smelling faintly of grease, but I listened like my life depended on it, because it did. I absorbed every knife technique, every sauce name, every rule of plating with the hunger of someone who had once been laughed at for reaching for seconds. My notebooks filled with sketches of food I had never tasted and terms I had never heard until now. The chefs who taught us were stern but brilliant, and I mirrored their movements until my hands remembered them without command. I didn't care about making friends. I came for knowledge, for proof that I could build more than shame out of this second chance. I wasn't the best in the class, not yet, but I was the one who never missed a lesson. Each night I left exhausted, shoes soaked from dishwater and brain spinning from recipes and ratios. I would walk back to the motel under the hum of street lamps, clutching borrowed cookbooks like sacred scripture. There, I practiced chopping on motel towels, whispered French terms to myself, and fell asleep dreaming of flame and flavor. I no longer cried at night, I planned. I was building a new life, one recipe at a time. And the more I learned, the less I feared the past. The shame began to dissolve under layers of confidence and skill. I wasn't healing with time, I was healing through fire, oil, and discipline. This wasn't survival anymore. This was the beginning of my rise. One rainy evening, after a particularly brutal practical exam, the lead instructor, Chef Morales, pulled me aside. He said nothing at first, only looked at my hands, blistered, stained, determined. Then he handed me a sealed envelope and muttered, "Don't stop." Inside was a letter from the school's foundation. I had been awarded a small scholarship based on extraordinary perseverance and potential. My knees nearly buckled as I read it. No one had called me extraordinary in years, and certainly not for who I was, only for what I had once endured. That piece of paper felt heavier than all the pots I had ever carried. It wasn't money, not really. It was permission to keep dreaming. It was someone, somewhere, saying, "We see you." I went back to class that night with my chin a little higher and my heart beating faster. The scholarship didn't change my situation. I still worked at dawn, still studied until I dropped, but it shifted something inside me. For the first time, I believed I might actually belong in this world of chefs, of flavors, of ambition. I began to ask questions, offer suggestions, and take risks in my cooking. I burned less and seasoned better. I stayed after class just to perfect my sauces. I had been surviving in silence, but now I was speaking through every dish I prepared. The scholarship didn't save me. It revealed me. And once revealed, I couldn't go back to hiding. Months later, our school hosted a regional cook-off, open to students and professionals alike. My hands trembled as I plated my entry, a humble dish, but one infused with every ounce of pain, grit, and soul I carried. When they announced my name as the winner, the applause felt distant, as if coming from another life. I stood on the makeshift stage, holding the trophy with both hands, unsure if I was dreaming or finally awake. Cameras flashed, and a local reporter asked for my story. I wanted to say it all, the laughter, the lasagna, the motel, but I simply smiled and said, "I cook with memory." That night, the article read, "The Comeback Cook, from Dish Pit to Champion." My name was in ink. My story had begun. Back at the diner, no one clapped, but they nodded. A cook slid a coffee toward me and said, "You earned that." It meant more than any standing ovation. My trophy sat on a shelf above the kitchen sink in the motel, gleaming in the glow of a cheap lamp. I stared at it for hours that night, not for its shine, but for what it proved. I wasn't who they said I was. I had power, talent, voice. The past hadn't disappeared, it had been transformed, turned into something that could win applause. I didn't need revenge. I needed forward. And that night, as I wiped my brow and set my alarm for another early shift, I whispered to myself, "You're not just coming back. You're becoming." With the prize money clenched in trembling hands, I walked into a scrapyard lot and found it, a rusty, dented food van with faded letters and a cracked windshield. Most people saw junk. I saw a future. I bought it without hesitation and spent every free moment scrubbing, painting, fixing, coaxing life back into it like a midwife delivering a second chance. I painted the words Mama's Feast in bright red letters on the side, shaky but bold. The first morning I opened the hatch, parked near a dusty construction site, my hands shook worse than they had the night I left home. I had nothing but borrowed pots, a camp stove, and recipes etched into memory. But as the first laborer stepped forward and I served him a bowl of chicken stew, I felt something shift. I wasn't a survivor anymore. I was a provider. Every dish I handed out was seasoned with more than spices. It held my scars, my silence, my strength. The men came back for seconds, then thirds. Word spread fast. I learned to stretch every onion, every potato, and still make it taste like love. My feet burned by noon, but I stood tall. I had no sign, no permit, no banner, only a van with a name and food that warmed people from the inside out. At night, I wiped the counters by flashlight, whispering thanks to the engine that hadn't quit on me. This was my sanctuary, my pulpit, my proof. I didn't need applause, I needed mouths fed, and in doing that, I fed myself. Hope didn't knock at my door. I built wheels under it and drove it forward. One afternoon, a man in a wrinkled suit paused as he passed the construction site, drawn by the scent of garlic and chicken. He stood in line like everyone else, asked no questions, and paid in cash. After his first bite, he froze. Then, to my surprise, tears welled in his eyes and spilled down his cheeks. "Tastes like my mother's," he whispered, voice cracking. He didn't know someone nearby had filmed the entire thing, from the trembling spoon to the quiet sob. The video was uploaded that evening, titled "Man Cries Over Soup Truck Meal," and by dawn, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. I didn't know how to be viral, I only knew how to cook. But suddenly, I was everywhere. People came not just for food, but for the story. They stood in line with their phones, their hunger, and their childhood memories. Comments flooded in from strangers saying they felt seen, nourished, healed by something they'd never even tasted. News vans pulled up asking for interviews, but I kept my head down, ladling soup with steady hands. This wasn't about fame, it was about redemption. They didn't know my whole story, but they felt it in the flavor. I let the food speak. Every tear, every burn, every insult, it had all led to this, someone crying not out of cruelty, but connection. For the first time in years, the tears around me weren't mocking. They were sacred. Within a week, the line outside Mama's Feast doubled, then tripled. I was barely keeping up when a woman in a sharp blazer asked if we could talk. I thought she wanted to complain, but instead she slid a business card across the counter and said, "We want to invest." I laughed, thinking it was a prank, but then another man came the next day offering the same. These weren't handouts, they were believers. People who had tasted not just my soup but my story, and wanted to help it grow. Some gave equipment, others offered space, a few helped with paperwork. They didn't see a tired woman in a dented van. They saw fire, vision, soul. For the first time, opportunity had a face, and it was smiling at me. At night, I sat in the back of the van with my knees pulled to my chest, staring at the stacks of forms, proposals, and ideas. Part of me was terrified, of failing again, of letting anyone close, of becoming visible. But another part, louder now, whispered, "You've earned this." Every drop of sweat, every slap of mockery, every burned fingertip had brought me here. I wasn't being handed success. I had cooked it from scratch. Opportunity had a taste now, richer than any dessert I'd ever plated. And though the path ahead still looked steep, I wasn't alone anymore. Strangers had become believers. Hope had become business. And I had become unstoppable. The paper was thin, but it felt like iron in my hands, the lease to a modest space in the heart of downtown. I signed it slowly, each stroke of the pen sealing a promise to myself and to every woman who had ever been laughed out of a room. The walls were cracked, the floor uneven, but to me, it looked like a cathedral. I walked through the empty space, running my fingers along dusty countertops, whispering, "You'll smell like redemption soon." There was no budget for elegance, only for resilience. I scrubbed, painted, patched holes, and stayed up until dawn reimagining the layout on napkins. No investor did this part for me, this was personal. This space would carry my name, but more importantly, it would carry my story. I taped up recipes on the walls like holy texts, letting the ghosts of old kitchens guide my hands. Every corner echoed with my past, the laughter I'd swallowed, the burns I'd endured, the voice I'd found in silence. I named it Evelyn's table, not just because it was mine, but because it was the table I had always deserved. One where no one would be mocked for eating, where hunger was met with compassion, not cruelty. I didn't want perfection. I wanted purpose. And as I set up the kitchen with second-hand tools and mismatched plates, I felt like I was putting my soul on a plate. This wasn't just a restaurant. It was a declaration. I was no longer cooking to survive. I was cooking to live. Opening night came fast, and I barely recognized myself in the reflection of the kitchen window. I wore a borrowed chef's jacket, slightly oversized, with my name embroidered in trembling thread. The line of people outside curved around the block, neighbors, workers, students, strangers with full hearts and empty stomachs. I breathed in, gripped the knife like an old friend, and began plating the dishes I had dreamt about in motel beds and midnight shifts. Each dish told a story, each flavor was a note in a symphony of survival. I didn't speak much, but my food did. The kitchen buzzed with life, and I moved through it like I'd always belonged there. When the first guest closed their eyes after a bite and whispered "incredible," something inside me healed. Every seat was filled, every hand raised in gratitude, and the clatter of silverware felt like music. Orders flew in faster than I could keep up, but I didn't panic, I danced. From the past to the sink, I floated, lost in the joy of creation. No one asked me where I had come from, and I didn't offer it. I simply served. And for the first time, applause came not as pity or spectacle, but as pure celebration. I watched couples toast, friends laugh, elders wipe tears. I saw myself reflected in their reactions, not as the woman mocked at a family table, but as a chef with a name and a purpose. That night, Evelyn's table wasn't just open. It was alive. The days turned into weeks, and Evelyn's table became a name people spoke with warmth. Articles were written, influencers posted reviews, and people began calling me chef with genuine respect. The staff grew, and I trained them with the same grit that once burned my hands in diner sinks. Yet every night, after the last table was cleared and the final dish dried, I would sit alone at the corner booth. The lights dimmed, the kitchen quieted, and a hollow ache settled in my chest. I had created something beautiful, something lasting. But I had no one to share it with. The applause was real, but the silence afterward was louder. I often stared at the empty chair across from me, imagining Olivia sitting there, not with scorn, but with pride. I wondered if she had seen the videos, read the articles, heard the whispers. I didn't know where she was, or if she still thought of me as the woman she humiliated with a single cruel sentence. I didn't hate her, I mourned her. The success had filled my pockets, but it hadn't healed every wound. There were nights I held a glass of wine and toasted no one, pretending it didn't sting. I had earned the world's respect, but not my daughter's love. And that absence, more than the heat or hunger, was the wound that refused to close. The call came early, just after sunrise, as I was checking deliveries at the back door of the restaurant. I almost didn't answer the unknown number, but something, maybe intuition, maybe pain, made me swipe the screen. Her voice came through barely above a whisper, cracked and trembling, the once confident tone now hollow with defeat. "Mom," she said, pausing, "do you know anyone hiring?" My heart clenched. She didn't apologize, didn't explain, she was too broken for that. I heard it all in the silence between her words. Her boutique had failed. The same pride that once mocked me now begged for survival. I didn't speak right away, afraid my voice would betray the storm swelling in my chest. I wanted to scream, cry, hang up, but I did none of those things. I simply asked her to come by the restaurant that afternoon. "We'll talk," I said, keeping my tone flat, guarding a heart that had been shattered by her before. I spent the rest of the day pacing between service, staring at the clock, wondering if she'd really show. A part of me didn't want her to. Another part wanted nothing more. What do you do when the person who destroyed you becomes the one who needs saving? I didn't know. All I knew was that she had called me Mom. And for that, I was already undone. When she walked through the restaurant door, I barely recognized her. The once polished daughter in heels and perfume now wore faded jeans and hollow eyes. Her face was thinner, her hair unkempt, her confidence erased. She didn't even look at the menu, just stood there, clutching a folder of resumes like a lifeline. I watched from the kitchen, hidden behind the pass, afraid that if I stepped forward too fast, she might run. She scanned the room, clearly searching for someone, but not expecting that someone to be me. When I finally emerged in my white chef's coat, her breath caught. She blinked, once, then again, and whispered, "Mom?" The word hit the floor between us like dropped glass, fragile, sharp, impossible to ignore. She hadn't seen me in years, and now I stood before her as someone she'd never imagined, a woman in charge, respected, dressed in pride instead of shame. She looked at me the way I once looked at myself in motel mirrors, unsure, guilty, desperate. I didn't rush to embrace her. I stood still, arms at my sides, heart pounding like a drum. She opened her mouth to speak but closed it again, words choked by regret. The silence stretched between us, not angry, just aching. And in that silence, I realized, this wasn't revenge. This was reckoning. When I finally stepped closer, she collapsed into the nearest chair, shoulders shaking as tears spilled down her cheeks. "I was so wrong," she said through sobs, "I didn't know. I didn't know hunger could humiliate you like that." She wasn't talking just about food, she meant dignity, worth, the kind of pain that gnaws at your soul. Her makeup smeared, her hands trembled, but her words came like water breaking a dam. "I laughed at you. I mocked you. And then life turned me into you." My breath caught in my throat, but I didn't let it show. I listened, not with the heart of a mother, but with the soul of a woman who had bled and burned and risen. I sat across from her, folding my hands to keep them from shaking. I didn't rush to forgive her. I let the silence stretch, not as punishment, but as space for her words to land, for her sorrow to settle. Finally, I said, "Now you understand." Not as vengeance, but as truth. She nodded, unable to lift her gaze. For all the years I dreamed of this apology, none of them prepared me for how small and real she looked in that moment. There was no victory here, only ache. But under all that ache, something else stirred, not trust, not yet, but the faintest root of healing. And that was enough, for now. I offered her a job, not out of guilt or pity, but because I wanted to see who she really was beneath the broken pride. "Hostess," I said, placing the apron on the counter. "Minimum wage. Long hours. No favors." She hesitated, as if expecting me to bend, to offer comfort or softness. But I had none left to give, not yet. Respect wouldn't come from a hug. It would come from proving herself where I had once stood invisible. I needed to see her earn it, not because she was my daughter, but because she had shattered me once without remorse. Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded and took the apron anyway. That was the first step. I trained her like I would any stranger, firm, clear, and with no shortcuts. She stood by the entrance, shoulders stiff, greeting guests with a forced smile that cracked more each hour. She didn't ask for breaks, didn't complain, and didn't once mention who she was to me. That silence was her repentance. I watched from the kitchen, arms crossed, eyes sharp. Part of me hoped she'd give up. Another part, quieter, older, prayed she wouldn't. I wasn't testing her cruelty. I was testing her capacity for transformation. If she wanted redemption, she'd find it not in forgiveness, but in humility. And slowly, painfully, she began to earn it. She learned quickly that the front of house wasn't glamorous, it was exhausting. Olivia wiped menus, refilled waters, dealt with rude customers who saw her as just another face in uniform. She, who once tossed words like daggers at me across a family table, now nodded respectfully to the dishwashers she'd once ignored. Her nails chipped, her back ached, her shoes blistered. But she kept showing up, day after day, with no makeup and less pride. The other staff didn't know our history. To them, she was just Olivia, the new girl with tired eyes and tight smiles. And I let it stay that way. If she wanted to rebuild, it had to be from the foundation. There were moments when I saw her falter, a broken glass, a customer's insult, a panicked glance toward me, but I never stepped in. She had to navigate it herself. She had to learn that dignity is something you protect, not something you're handed. She cleaned the bathrooms without flinching, took the late shifts without question, and started saying thank you with a sincerity that made the cooks raise their eyebrows. Little by little, she earned their respect. Not because of her past, but because of her present effort. I still didn't call her my daughter. Not yet. I wasn't ready. But I called her part of the team. And somehow, that meant more. One night, after the last customer had gone and the floor was swept, we sat in silence at a corner table, sharing what was left of the soup. The same soup that once made strangers cry now tasted like quiet truth. She didn't speak for a long time, just stared at her spoon, swirling it through the broth like searching for courage. Then, softly, she said, "I think about that night, every day." My chest tightened, but I said nothing. She continued, voice cracking, "I didn't realize how easy it is to break someone. How fast a moment becomes a scar." I looked at her, and for the first time, saw not the girl who hurt me, but the woman who had suffered too. She didn't ask for forgiveness that night. She didn't beg. She simply admitted her guilt and let the silence hold it. And somehow, that honesty carried more weight than any apology ever could. I nodded, slowly, allowing the moment to settle like steam rising from a hot bowl. We didn't cry. We didn't hug. But something shifted, a fracture, sealed. I pushed a slice of bread toward her without a word. She took it. We ate in silence, and for the first time in years, it didn't feel like something was missing. It felt like something was beginning. A conversation. A bridge. A return. She finally asked, her voice barely a whisper, "Do you think you could ever forgive me?" The restaurant was quiet, the kitchen dark, only the soft hum of the refrigerator keeping time with our breath. I looked at her, the grease on her collar, the weariness in her shoulders, the humility in her eyes, and saw not the girl who once mocked me, but the woman willing to kneel before her own past. "Remorse," I said gently, "is the first ingredient of change." She flinched as if expecting rejection, but I reached across the table and touched her hand. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't cinematic. It was quiet, real, human. I didn't say the words, she felt them. And in that warmth, something broken began to mend. We sat like that for a moment that felt suspended in time, two women bound not just by blood but by scars earned and lessons learned. I didn't absolve her completely, forgiveness isn't erasure. But I let her feel accepted again. I allowed her to know that despite the harm, she was still worthy of love. She cried without shame, and I let her. Because now, it was no longer about punishing the past, it was about building the future. And in that moment, I didn't feel like the woman she once humiliated. I felt like her mother again. Not perfect, not saintly, but present. And that was more than enough. We started small, side by side in the kitchen after hours, testing new recipes on scraps and leftovers. She'd bring me wild ideas scribbled on notepads, a twist on mole, a soup inspired by street vendors, desserts with unlikely pairings. I'd read them silently, then offer spices, timing, and instinct. It became a dance, her curiosity and my experience learning how to move together again. The menu slowly began to reflect this strange, beautiful fusion, her youth and my history, her reinvention and my tradition. We weren't just cooking. We were learning to trust again, not through words, but through flavors. The staff started noticing the laughter, cautious but real, bubbling between us like something simmering back to life. There were still tense moments, mistakes, silences that lingered too long. But we didn't give up. We stayed late chopping vegetables side by side, arguing over salt, laughing over burnt crusts, rediscovering how to speak without hurting. Olivia began to find her voice in the kitchen, not the harsh one that once wounded, but a voice rooted in creativity and care. I began letting go of the memory of her cruelty, replacing it with memories of effort, tenderness, and second chances. We started signing the menus together, Chef Evelyn and Olivia, a name that carried both pain and promise. Trust didn't arrive in a flood. It crept in like the smell of bread baking, slow, deep, impossible to ignore. Quietly, without telling anyone, I returned to the house I once fled from in shame. The realtor looked surprised when I made an offer, not because it was low, but because the place was days away from foreclosure. The dining room still had the same table, though dust-covered and slightly warped from years of neglect. I ran my hand across it, remembering the night of the lasagna, the crumbs, the laughter that stabbed like knives. But this time I didn't flinch. I had come not to relive pain, but to rewrite it. I signed the papers and took the keys with trembling hands. This wasn't just a purchase, it was a reclamation. A vow to transform the place of my undoing into a sanctuary of healing. I didn't tell Olivia right away. I needed to feel it alone first, walk the hallway where I once wiped away invisible tears, stand in the kitchen where no one offered help. I stood in the doorway of my old room, the wallpaper peeling like memory itself, and whispered, "I'm not her anymore." And I wasn't. I was no longer the woman who swallowed shame in silence. I was someone who had turned insult into industry, cruelty into cuisine, abandonment into authority. Buying that house wasn't about nostalgia. It was about power. The kind that doesn't scream, the kind that returns, with quiet dignity, and says, "I still choose to rebuild." I handed Olivia an envelope on a quiet morning before the restaurant opened. She looked confused at first, then curious, then stunned as she pulled out the keys and a folded note. Her hands trembled slightly as she read the words I had written simply, "Time to rebuild together, no ridicule allowed." She looked up at me, her lips parting to speak, but no words came. I just nodded, silently inviting her to accept not just a house, but a legacy rewritten. The keys clinked softly in her palm, heavier with meaning than weight. She had returned to me not as the daughter I lost, but as the woman I had helped shape from pain. And I was giving her more than property. I was giving her the chance to help rewrite the story that once broke us both. We drove together in silence to the old house, the neighborhood still lined with the same crooked sidewalks and childhood ghosts. When she stepped inside and saw the table, the walls, the kitchen, she covered her mouth with her hand, eyes wide with memory and disbelief. "You really bought it back," she whispered, and I nodded again. She walked through each room like stepping through pages of a diary she thought had been burned. There were no speeches, no grand gestures. Just the quiet awe of two women standing in the aftermath of a war they had both survived. And now, with a set of keys and a second chance, we were ready to rebuild not just walls, but ourselves. We didn't hire a crew. We did it ourselves, paint under our nails, sweat on our foreheads, laughter stumbling into the silence like a child learning to walk. Every brushstroke across the once ugly walls felt like erasing years of humiliation, one memory at a time. We scrubbed tiles where shoes had once stomped in mockery. We replaced curtains that had framed cruelty and patched ceilings that had heard too many insults. Olivia played music on an old speaker, humming along as she sanded the dining chairs we used to sit on when our family was still a fragile illusion. The house stopped feeling haunted and began to breathe again. Not perfect, but alive. And that was enough. Each evening, we stood back and looked at our work, covered in dust and satisfaction. I watched Olivia grow steadier in her steps, more confident in her touch, like every repair she made on the house mended something inside her too. We didn't talk about the past, not because we were avoiding it, but because it no longer controlled the air between us. There was healing in every repaired cabinet, every fresh coat of paint, every shared silence that no longer carried shame. The home began to smell like cinnamon and sawdust, a new kind of warmth. We were no longer trying to forget what happened. We were proving we had the power to transform it. The past wasn't erased. It was reworked into something livable. The invitations were simple, handwritten cards given to neighbors, former coworkers, teachers, and the diner staff who had once offered quiet kindness. We planned the meal together, a fusion of old family recipes and new culinary experiments, seasoned with stories and second chances. The long dining table, once the scene of my greatest humiliation, now gleamed under soft lights and floral centerpieces. Olivia and I stood in the kitchen shoulder to shoulder, plating dishes with careful pride. Guests arrived slowly, faces full of curiosity and joy, many unaware of the full history within those freshly painted walls. But I knew. And every plate I served was a chapter of that history rewritten. Laughter filled the room, not cruel, not sharp, but warm, free, cleansing. Children ran through the hallways where tears once fell. Elders complimented the spice in the soup and asked for seconds. The food, the space, the energy, it all felt sacred, as if we were blessing every corner of the past with the joy of the present. When I caught Olivia wiping away a quiet tear as she watched the room glow with life, I said nothing. I simply touched her shoulder. This wasn't just a dinner. It was a ceremony. A resurrection. A proof that healing doesn't whisper, it sings. And that night, the house finally became a home again. That night, as the last plates were cleared and the chair scraped softly across the wooden floor, I heard it, a sound so delicate, so unexpected, it made my heart pause. Olivia was laughing. Not the sharp, mocking laugh I once knew, but a gentle, unguarded chuckle that slipped from her lips like sunlight through a window. It wasn't aimed at anyone. It wasn't cruel. It was pure, a product of peace. I looked across the room and saw her laughing with one of the old dishwashers, trading stories over leftover empanadas. For a moment, I didn't see the past. I saw my daughter as she was meant to be, kind, grounded, and whole. And that laugh, that moment, healed something deep within me. I didn't interrupt her. I didn't call attention to it. I just smiled and leaned back in my chair, letting the warmth of the evening wrap around me like a soft shawl. That laugh was everything I had worked for, not the trophies, not the headlines, not even the restaurant itself. It was proof that wounds can heal and people can grow if given enough truth, time, and tenderness. I had spent years imagining revenge, justice, validation. But none of that compared to hearing my daughter laugh from joy, not cruelty. The house no longer echoed with mockery. It now held memories in progress, soft and safe. And I knew, without needing anyone to say it aloud, that we had finally broken the curse. A few weeks later, there was a knock at the restaurant door just before opening. I turned the lock expecting a delivery, but instead found him, my husband, or rather, the man who once wore that title. He looked thinner, older, worn down by losses he hadn't expected life to deal him. In his hand, a folded paper. "I heard what you've done," he said, not meeting my eyes. "I need work. Anything. The irony was sharp. The man who once smirked as I was ridiculed now stood before me, silent, ashamed. I didn't say yes immediately. I studied his face, searching for something beyond need. And when I finally spoke, my voice didn't shake. "You can wash dishes," I told him plainly. "Minimum wage. Therapy once a week. And you show up early." He blinked, as if he expected me to still bleed when he knocked. But I didn't. I had no hate left. Only boundaries. The staff watched in silence as I handed him an apron and walked away. He would scrub pans like I once did, and maybe, in the heat and the steam, he'd find some piece of himself worth salvaging. I didn't owe him grace. I chose to offer it because power no longer interested me. Healing did. And sometimes, grace doesn't sound like forgiveness, it sounds like a mop bucket rolling across a tile floor. That night, I sat at the old table once more, not as a victim, not as a survivor, but as a matriarch. The walls around me no longer whispered shame, they held laughter, memory, and growth. Olivia sat across from me, her hands calloused like mine, her smile softer now, truer. I poured 2 glasses of wine and raised mine gently. "In this house," I said, letting the words rise slow and firm, "no one is mocked for eating." She looked at me, eyes full, lips trembling. I added, "Here, everyone is fed with love." The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was sacred. We clinked glasses, not as mother and daughter repairing something broken, but as women who had survived themselves. The meal was simple: lentil stew, crusty bread, warm flan. But it was seasoned with peace, with forgiveness, with freedom. There were no cameras, no guests, no applause. Just us. Just heart. And as I looked out the window into the quiet street where everything once fell apart, I knew the truth. I had been mocked, shamed, forgotten. But I had also risen, remade, remembered. And in this house, love was the only thing we ever served without measure.